Jacob had always been the type of person who valued his independence. When he purchased his new home near the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, he saw it as the perfect place to settle down. The house was modest, with a wide driveway and enough space for him to enjoy peace after long workdays. But more than the house itself, Jacob loved his vehicle, a sturdy black Jeep that had been with him through countless road trips, muddy trails, and snowy mountain paths. To him, it wasn't just a car. It was a reminder of freedom, of places he had been, and of the strength to go anywhere he needed. When Jacob parked the Jeep in his driveway on his first day, he didn't think much of it. He gave it a quick wipe down, patted the hood like greeting an old friend, and went inside to unpack boxes. Little did he know, the Jeep was already drawing attention. From across the street, Karen, the long-standing president of the Homeowners Association, had her eyes locked on the vehicle. Karen was the type of person who took the HOA handbook more seriously than most people took national law. She believed every lawn should look freshly cut, every car washed and shining, and every flower planted in neat rows approved by the community committee. In her mind, appearances defined respect, and anything that didn't fit her vision was a direct challenge to her authority. The Jeep, with its rugged tires, steel bumper, and matte finish, was the opposite of what Karen believed belonged in her neighborhood. As she sipped her morning coffee by the window, she muttered to herself, "This isn't some campground. This is a respectable street." To Karen, the Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was the first sign of what she imagined to be chaos. Jacob, meanwhile, went about his day unaware of the storm quietly brewing. He enjoyed the calm of his new home, walking around the backyard, imagining where he might set up a small garden or place a hammock. Neighbors passing by gave him polite waves, though some glanced curiously at the Jeep before quickly moving on. By evening, Jacob stepped out to check the mail. He noticed a few houses had the same type of car, polished SUVs, sleek sedans, and a handful of luxury models that gleamed under the setting sun. His Jeep looked different, yes, but he didn't see it as a problem. That night, as the quiet neighborhood prepared for bed, Karen sat at her dining table flipping through the HOA rulebook. She highlighted passages she thought could be used against Jacob's Jeep. No commercial vehicles, no visible off-road equipment, no unsightly property. None of them truly fit, but Karen was determined to make them apply. She tapped her pen on the page and whispered, "I'll get that thing out of here." The next morning, Jacob stepped outside with a cup of coffee in hand and noticed Karen standing on the sidewalk across the street. She wasn't walking her dog or talking to a neighbor or even pretending to be on a casual stroll. She was just staring at his driveway with narrowed eyes. Jacob raised his mug in a polite wave. "Good morning," he called out. Karen pursed her lips but offered no response. She simply turned and walked back to her house, muttering something under her breath. Jacob shrugged, assuming she wasn't in a friendly mood, and went back inside. But by the end of that same day, as the sun dipped behind the houses, a folded piece of paper appeared tucked under his windshield wiper. At first, Jacob thought it was a flyer. Instead, it was a printed letter bearing the HOA's letterhead. It stated in firm words that his vehicle was in violation of community standards and must be relocated to a garage or removed entirely. Jacob read the letter twice, then chuckled softly to himself. "Violation," he said aloud. "For parking my car in my own driveway?" He shook his head, crumpled the paper, and tossed it into the recycling bin. To him, it was nothing more than a misunderstanding, one that would resolve itself with time. What Jacob didn't realize was that to Karen, this was only the beginning. She had drawn a line in her mind, and she was certain she had the authority to enforce it. And as far as she was concerned, that Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was a challenge to her power as HOA president. The morning after Jacob received the first note, he brushed it off as a minor nuisance. In his experience, paperwork like that usually disappeared once people realized they were making a fuss over nothing. But in this neighborhood, especially under Karen's watchful eye, things were never so simple. By midweek, another paper appeared on his windshield. This one wasn't folded but carefully placed under the wiper, as if Karen wanted to make sure he saw it the moment he stepped outside. It was longer than the first and carried even more official-looking language. "Dear homeowner," it began, "your vehicle continues to be in violation of community standards. Failure to comply may result in penalties or further action by the HOA." Jacob read the letter slowly, eyebrows raised. There were no specifics, only vague references to standards and aesthetic guidelines. He chuckled quietly, shaking his head as he tucked the letter into his pocket. Later that afternoon, Jacob decided to take the Jeep for a drive. He rolled down the windows, enjoying the breeze, and returned about an hour later. When he pulled into his driveway, he noticed two neighbors across the street, whispering as they watched. They quickly turned away when he caught their eyes, pretending to focus on their mailboxes. Jacob had seen this before, neighbors who wanted peace, but also didn't want to get on Karen's bad side. It was clear they already knew about the brewing tension. He didn't blame them for keeping quiet, but he also wasn't about to be intimidated. The following morning, Jacob woke to find not just a note, but a photograph. Someone had printed out a picture of his Jeep parked in the driveway and taped it to his front door. Across the bottom was a handwritten message in bold ink, proof of repeated violation. Jacob stared at the paper for a moment, then laughed in disbelief. "Proof of what?" he muttered. "Proof that I parked my car where I'm supposed to?" He carefully peeled the tape away, folded the picture, and slipped it into a folder he kept in his desk. If Karen wanted to start a paper trail, he figured it couldn't hurt to keep his own. That evening, as the sun lowered and porch lights flickered on, Karen herself appeared on his doorstep. She rang the bell with sharp precision, standing tall with a clipboard tucked under her arm. When Jacob opened the door, she smiled, though it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good evening, Jacob," she said. "I hope you've had time to review the notices we've provided." "I've seen them," Jacob replied calmly. "Though I can't say I understand them. My Jeep is registered, insured, and legally parked in my own driveway." Karen's smile tightened. "Our community has standards, and certain vehicles simply do not fit the appearance we strive to maintain. Off-road vehicles like yours create an atmosphere that does not align with our goals." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Atmosphere? Karen, it's just a car. It's not leaking oil, it's not broken down, and it's certainly not a hazard. It's simply parked in my driveway like every other car on this street." "Rules are rules," Karen pressed. "The board has authority to require compliance. If you refuse, there will be consequences." Jacob leaned casually against the doorframe. "Then I'd suggest you review your authority very carefully before you make demands you can't enforce." His voice remained calm, steady, and almost polite, which seemed to frustrate Karen even more. She tapped her clipboard with her pen and huffed. "I'll be reporting this to the board. You'll be hearing from us again very soon." Without another word, she turned on her heel and marched down the driveway, her clipboard clutched tightly. Jacob watched her go, shaking his head with a faint smile. As the days passed, the pressure continued. Neighbors told him in hushed tones that Karen had been bringing up his Jeep in every meeting. She claimed it lowered property values, frightened potential buyers, and made the neighborhood look unruly. One neighbor, an older gentleman named Mr. Harris, quietly approached Jacob one afternoon as they both collected mail. "I'll be honest with you," he said softly, glancing around to make sure Karen wasn't nearby. "That Jeep of yours isn't bothering anyone, but Karen, once she decides something doesn't belong, she doesn't stop until she gets her way. Just be prepared." Jacob thanked him for the warning and went back inside. He wasn't afraid of Karen's persistence, but he could see she was determined to make this into something much bigger than it needed to be. Still, as he looked out the window at his Jeep parked calmly in the driveway, he made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't going to back down. This was his property, his home, and his life. No matter how many notes, photos, or threats appeared, the Jeep wasn't going anywhere. And though Jacob didn't know it yet, Karen's next move would push the situation far beyond simple letters and complaints. By the end of the second week, Jacob had already collected a small folder of letters, photographs, and notices, all pointing to the same complaint: his Jeep. Each document was more dramatic than the last, warning of fines, penalties, and community action. Jacob had grown almost amused by the persistence, but the neighborhood itself was starting to feel the weight of Karen's campaign. Neighbors began whispering when he walked by. Some offered polite nods, but most quickly turned their eyes away. It wasn't that they disliked Jacob, they simply didn't want to be caught on the wrong side of Karen. Her reputation was well known. If she decided someone was a problem, she made sure the entire community saw them that way. One Friday evening, Jacob was enjoying a quiet dinner when the doorbell rang. When he opened the door, Karen stood there again, clipboard in hand, her expression sharp and determined. She didn't wait to be invited in. Instead, she launched into her speech. "Jacob," she said firmly, "we've given you ample opportunity to comply with community standards. Yet your vehicle remains parked in full view against the wishes of the HOA board. This is your final warning before formal action is taken. Jacob leaned casually against the doorframe, arms crossed. Formal action? Karen, I've read your notices. Not one of them cites an actual rule that applies to my Jeep. You're creating problems where none exist. Her lips pressed into a thin line. The appearance of this neighborhood is at stake. You may not realize it, but prospective buyers notice things like that vehicle. It gives the impression that we allow disorder, that we don't maintain our standards. With all due respect, Jacob replied calmly, that's your opinion, not a rule. And unless you can show me where in your handbook it says my Jeep can't be parked in my driveway, it's staying right where it is. For a moment, Karen's composure cracked. Her cheeks flushed and her grip on the clipboard tightened, but she quickly regained her voice. I've been president of this HOA for 6 years, and I can assure you no one has ever ignored our standards the way you have. If you think you can just dismiss the authority of this board, you're mistaken. Jacob gave a faint smile. Authority is one thing, overreach is another. I respect community guidelines when they're fair and reasonable, but I won't be bullied, Karen, not by you and not by a stack of papers that don't hold up to scrutiny. The calmness in his tone seemed to fuel Karen's frustration even further. She tapped her clipboard against her side, clearly searching for words. Finally, she said, if you continue to ignore this, don't be surprised when consequences arrive at your door. I'll make sure of it. With that, she turned and marched down the driveway, her heels clicking against the pavement. Jacob watched her retreat, shaking his head with a sigh. Consequences, he muttered. We'll see about that. Over the next few days, Karen escalated her efforts. Jacob noticed her circling the block in her SUV, slowing down each time she passed his house, phone in hand as she snapped more photos. One afternoon, he caught her standing in front of his property, pointing at the Jeep while speaking animatedly to another board member. They both scribbled notes as though preparing for a trial. Then came the public confrontation. Jacob was unloading groceries from the back of his Jeep when Karen strode up, voice raised enough for nearby neighbors to hear. Jacob, you've left us no choice, she declared. Your refusal to cooperate is a direct violation of the spirit of this neighborhood. If you continue to disregard the HOA's directives, we will take further steps. Several neighbors peeked from porches and windows, drawn by the raised voices. Jacob could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond. He set the grocery bag down and faced Karen squarely. Karen, let me be very clear. This is my home. That is my vehicle. It is legally registered, insured, and properly parked. Unless you can show me an actual rule that says otherwise, I suggest you stop wasting your time and mine. The calm, steady tone carried through the street. A few neighbors exchanged glances, surprised at how directly Jacob challenged her. Karen's jaw tightened, and for a moment she seemed lost for words. Finally she snapped, "We'll see about that," and stormed off, her clipboard tucked tightly under her arm. Jacob shook his head, picked up the grocery bag, and carried it inside. He wasn't rattled. If anything, he was growing more certain that Karen was overstepping. Still, he had no idea how far she was willing to go or how soon she would make her boldest move yet. The weekend arrived with a calm breeze drifting across the neighborhood. Jacob had planned to spend Saturday morning working in the backyard, trimming hedges and setting up a new hammock. For once, he wanted to enjoy his home without thinking about HOA notes or confrontations. But Karen had a different plan. Around noon, Jacob heard the sound of a heavy engine rumbling outside. He set down his garden shears and walked around to the front yard. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. A tow truck, large and loud, was parked in front of his driveway. The driver was already lowering the ramp, preparing to hook up his Jeep. And there, standing beside the truck with arms crossed and a satisfied smile, was Karen. Jacob's first instinct was disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. He walked toward the driveway, his expression calm though his steps were steady and deliberate. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice clear enough to carry across the yard. Karen lifted her clipboard like it was a badge of authority. "We've given you multiple warnings, Jacob. You've chosen to ignore them. This vehicle is in violation of our community standards, and as president of the HOA, I have every right to remove it." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Every right? Really? Because I'd love to see where in your handbook it says you can tow someone's personal vehicle from their own driveway." "Don't play games," Karen snapped. This community thrives on order, and your refusal to comply threatens that order. The board voted, and we've authorized removal. Consider this your final lesson in respecting the rules." The tow truck driver, clearly caught between two strong personalities, hesitated. "Look, lady," he said carefully, "I usually need a signed request from law enforcement or the city before I hook up a car. This is someone's private property." "It's authorized," Karen insisted, thrusting a paper toward him. "You have your instructions, do your job." Jacob pulled his phone from his pocket and pressed the record button. "Go ahead," he said evenly. "Let's get all of this on video. You're about to tow a legally registered, insured, and fully permitted vehicle from the driveway of its owner. I hope you're prepared to explain that." The driver glanced nervously between Jacob and Karen. "Ma'am, are you absolutely sure about this? I don't want to get caught up in something I'm not supposed to." "Just hook it up," Karen barked, her patience slipping. "This man has no respect for authority. He thinks he can do whatever he wants. Well, not in this neighborhood, not while I'm president." Jacob didn't flinch. He leaned casually against the mailbox, his phone still recording, his calmness unshaken. Neighbors began to gather, some stepping onto porches, others peeking from windows. Whispers filled the air as people realized what was happening. "She's really going through with it," one neighbor murmured. "Can she even do that?" another whispered. Jacob stood silently, letting the scene unfold. Karen, on the other hand, looked energized by the audience. She raised her voice, declaring, "This is what happens when someone thinks they're above the rules. No one is above the HOA." The tow truck driver finally crouched down to attach the hook to the Jeep's front axle. Jacob's camera stayed trained on him, capturing every second. "Sir," the driver said cautiously, "if you've got paperwork that says otherwise, now's the time to show it. I really don't want to." Before Jacob could respond, the sound of engines filled the street. Two unmarked SUVs rolled into the neighborhood, dark-tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun. They pulled up sharply, one blocking the tow truck's path, the other stopping just behind Jacob's Jeep. Doors opened and men in plain clothes stepped out, badges flashing at their belts. The quiet chatter of neighbors turned into stunned silence. One of the officers walked straight toward the tow truck driver. "What's going on here?" he asked firmly. The driver pointed at Karen. "She said this vehicle needed to be towed, said it was against HOA rules." The officer's eyes narrowed. "This vehicle?" he repeated, gesturing to Jacob's Jeep. "Yes," Karen said quickly, stepping forward. "I'm the HOA president. This man refuses to comply with our rules, so we authorized removal. The vehicle doesn't belong in this neighborhood." The officer studied her for a long moment, then turned back toward Jacob. "Sir, is this your vehicle?" Jacob gave a small nod. "Yes, though from the look on your face, I think it might be yours too." A faint smile crossed the officer's lips. "That's correct. This Jeep belongs to our task force. It's registered under our department and currently assigned for operations. And you," he turned his sharp gaze back to Karen, "are interfering with government property." The air went still. Karen's triumphant expression collapsed into shock. The tow truck driver froze mid-motion, quickly stepping back from the Jeep. The gathered neighbors whispered louder, their disbelief clear. Jacob kept recording, his calm smile never leaving his face. "I did try to warn you, Karen," he said softly. The moment the officers revealed the Jeep belonged to their task force, the street fell into silence. Even the birds seemed to quiet as every eye fixed on Karen. Her confidence, so steady moments earlier, wavered like a candle in the wind. "Government property?" she repeated, her voice cracking slightly. "That can't be right. This is just his car." She jabbed a finger toward Jacob, her eyes wide with disbelief. The lead officer crossed his arms. "Ma'am, this vehicle is officially registered under our department. It is assigned for operations. Right now, you are interfering with a piece of active law enforcement equipment. Do you understand the seriousness of that?" The tow truck driver immediately began retracting his ramp, muttering under his breath. "I knew this felt wrong," he said, shaking his head. "Lady, you didn't say this was police property. I'm not touching this thing." Jacob remained leaning against the mailbox, his phone still recording. His calm expression hadn't changed, but inside he felt a mix of relief and satisfaction. For weeks he had endured Karen's pressure, but now the truth had arrived with flashing badges and unmarked vehicles. Neighbors shifted on their porches, whispering among themselves. Did she really just try to tow a police car? One woman whispered. Oh, she's in for it now. Karen, however, wasn't ready to give up. She straightened her shoulders, holding onto her clipboard like a shield. This is a private neighborhood, she argued. The homeowners association has full authority to enforce its rules, and that vehicle violates our standards. I don't care who it belongs to. The officer cut her off sharply. Ma'am, stop right there. You don't get to override the law with your HOA policies. This isn't about paint colors or lawn height. This is about government property, and you've just attempted to interfere with it. The weight of his words settled over the street. Karen's face flushed crimson, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for a response. She turned to the crowd of neighbors, hopping for support, but the faces watching her were filled with shock, not loyalty. The second officer approached Jacob, lowering his voice so only he could hear. We appreciate your cooperation, he said. Thank you for staying calm. This could have escalated. Jacob gave a small nod. I figured the truth would show itself eventually, he replied. She's been relentless since the day I moved in. The officer nodded knowingly. Well, she's about to learn there are lines you don't cross. Meanwhile, Karen's composure was slipping fast. You don't understand, she insisted, her voice rising. I've worked hard to keep this community in order. People trust me to protect property values. If I let one exception slide, everything falls apart. That Jeep sends the wrong message. The lead officer stepped closer, his tone firm but measured. The only message you're sending right now is that you believe your personal authority outweighs the law. I'm telling you plainly, if you continue interfering with this vehicle, you could face serious legal consequences. The murmurs among the neighbors grew louder. Phrases like, she's gone too far, and this is unbelievable floated through the air. Jacob finally decided to speak, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. Karen, I told you from the beginning to check your facts. You kept pushing, kept escalating, and now here we are. This isn't about order or standards anymore. This is about control, and today you found out there are limits to that. The words struck deeper than he intended. Karen's hand trembled slightly as she clutched her clipboard, her authority unraveling in front of the very people she had once commanded with ease. The tow truck driver climbed back into his cab, shaking his head. I'm out of here, he muttered, starting the engine. Not worth the trouble. The truck rumbled away, leaving the Jeep untouched and gleaming in Jacob's driveway. The officers gave Karen one last look before turning to leave. Consider this a warning, the lead officer said. Stay away from this vehicle and stop harassing its owner. Next time we won't be so patient. As the unmarked SUVs pulled away, the crowd slowly dispersed, but the whispers lingered. Neighbors who had once been silent in the face of Karen's authority now traded knowing glances. The image of her standing powerless before law enforcement was something they wouldn't soon forget. Jacob slipped his phone back into his pocket, the recording saved safely. He looked across the street at Karen, who stood frozen on the sidewalk, her face pale. For the first time, she didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she turned and walked quickly toward her house, closing the door behind her with a sharp click. Jacob exhaled slowly, the tension of the moment finally leaving his shoulders. His Jeep sat quietly in the driveway, unchanged, unbothered, and untouchable. But deep down, he knew Karen wasn't finished. Her pride had taken a public blow, and someone like her wasn't likely to retreat without at least trying one more time. The difference now was clear. The neighborhood had seen her fall, and Jacob no longer stood alone. The days following the towing incident carried a different atmosphere in the neighborhood. Jacob noticed it almost immediately. When he walked to his mailbox, neighbors who once avoided eye contact now offered nods or small smiles. Conversations that had once quieted when he passed now carried on, some even including him. It was as if the invisible barrier Karen had built between him and the rest of the community had cracked. But Karen herself was far from admitting defeat. From behind the closed blinds of her house, she watched the street with a nervous energy. She had built her entire identity on being the firm, decisive president of the Homeowners Association. For years, her word had been final. Now, in front of half the neighborhood, her authority had been questioned, and worse, dismissed by law enforcement. On Monday evening, Karen called for an emergency HOA board meeting at the clubhouse. Jacob didn't attend, he wasn't a member, nor did he care to sit through a gathering that would likely be filled with accusations. But he heard about it afterward from Mr. Harris, the older gentleman who often offered quiet warnings. She tried to explain the whole thing as a misunderstanding. Mr. Harris said, lowering his voice as they stood near the mailbox. Claimed she didn't know it was a government vehicle. Said she was only following the standards we voted to uphold. Jacob raised an eyebrow. And how did the board take that? Mr. Harris gave a faint smile. Let's just say not everyone was convinced. Some of them are starting to wonder if her leadership has gone too far, especially after the police told her to back off. Jacob nodded, unsurprised. Pride makes people dig deeper when they should be stepping back. Word of Karen's mistake spread quickly through casual conversations. At the local park, parents whispered about how she had nearly had a task force jeep hauled away. At the coffee shop just outside the neighborhood, someone joked that Karen was lucky she wasn't in handcuffs. Every version of the story seemed to paint her more foolish and more reckless than the last. Meanwhile, Jacob continued living as he always had. Each morning, his jeep sat proudly in the driveway. Sometimes he noticed Karen's blinds shift when he walked outside, but she never approached him. Her silence, after weeks of relentless pressure, was almost unsettling. One afternoon, however, she finally emerged. Jacob was washing the jeep, the hose spraying arcs of water across its surface, when Karen walked across the street. She carried no clipboard this time, only a tight expression and a forced smile. Jacob, she began, her tone strained but attempting civility, I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. Perhaps I was a little too firm in enforcing the rules. Jacob paused, resting the sponge on the hood of the jeep. A little too firm, he repeated, his voice even. Yes, she said quickly, as though rushing to control the narrative. I simply wanted to maintain the appearance of the neighborhood. I wasn't aware your vehicle had special circumstances. Had I known, of course, things would have been different. Jacob studied her carefully. Special circumstances or not, Karen, it wouldn't have mattered. You went after me because my Jeep didn't fit your idea of what belongs here. You didn't check the rules. You didn't ask questions. You just decided you had the right to control it. Her forced smile wavered. I was only doing my duty as president. Jacob shook his head slowly. There's a difference between duty and control. What you did wasn't leadership, it was harassment. The word seemed to sting. For a moment, Karen's eyes hardened, but then she quickly looked away. Well, she said stiffly, perhaps we can move forward from this. I'd prefer not to dwell on past misunderstandings. Jacob gave a small nod, though his expression stayed firm. Moving forward is fine, but I won't forget how far you were willing to go, neither will the neighborhood. Karen opened her mouth to reply, but closed it again. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her house, her posture a little less confident than before. That evening, Jacob sat on his porch, watching as neighbors walked their dogs and children rode bikes along the street. Every so often, someone glanced at his Jeep and gave him a knowing smile, as if to say they, too, remembered what had happened. The story of Karen's overreach had spread too far to be ignored or erased. And while she might try to rewrite it, the truth was plain. Karen had overstepped, and in doing so, she had revealed the limits of her authority. By the following week, the neighborhood no longer looked at Karen as the untouchable authority she once believed herself to be. Jacob could sense it in the way neighbors carried themselves at community events. Where once they would nod obediently or avoid speaking against her, they now whispered freely, some even chuckling when her name came up. The shift became undeniable at the next official homeowners association meeting. It was a Thursday evening in the clubhouse, and though Jacob wasn't an HOA member, he decided to attend as a guest. He didn't usually bother with these gatherings, but after everything that had happened, he felt it was worth hearing what Karen would say. The clubhouse buzzed with quiet chatter as residents filled the folding chairs. Karen sat at the front, her clipboard neatly placed on the table, her posture upright. She cleared her throat, calling the meeting to order. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice carrying the same sharp authority she had always used. We have several agenda items tonight regarding landscaping, parking regulations, and upcoming community events. I trust we can move through them efficiently. The first few minutes were routine. Talk of trimming hedges, repainting mailboxes, and scheduling a summer barbecue. But tension simmered just beneath the surface. Jacob could see it in the way people shifted in their seats, waiting. It didn't take long before someone broke the silence. A woman near the back, Mrs. Gomez, raised her hand. Before we go further, I think we need to discuss what happened last week with Jacob's Jeep, she said plainly. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Karen stiffened, her smile tightening. That was an unfortunate misunderstanding, she replied quickly. The matter has already been resolved. Resolved? Mr. Harris leaned forward in his chair. Karen, you tried to have a law enforcement vehicle towed from someone's driveway, and the police had to come here to tell you to stand down. I don't think the community sees that as a small misunderstanding. Several heads nodded. Jacob watched quietly, arms crossed, as Karen's grip on her clipboard whitened. I was enforcing the standards we all agreed upon, she insisted. I acted with the best interests of the neighborhood in mind. No, another voice interjected, this time Mr. Patel, who rarely spoke at meetings. You acted with your own interests in mind. You've been targeting Jacob since the day he moved in. We've all seen it. Gasps and murmurs filled the room again. Karen's face flushed, her usual control slipping further. That's not true, she snapped. I treat everyone equally. Jacob finally spoke up, his voice steady but firm. With respect, Karen, I think most of the neighborhood knows that isn't accurate. You singled me out because my Jeep didn't fit your idea of what belongs here. You didn't ask questions. You didn't listen when I told you it was authorized. You just assumed you had the power to remove it. All eyes turned to Karen. Her expression hardened, but her voice faltered as she tried to regain control. We can't allow one person's choices to lower the standards of this community. If we do, where does it end? Mrs. Gomez spoke again, this time with quiet firmness. There's a difference between protecting the community and abusing authority, and last week you crossed that line. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the words settling like a stone in the center of the clubhouse. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, another resident raised their voice. Maybe it's time we reconsider who should be leading this association. The statement hung in the air like thunder. Karen's eyes widened, scanning the room for support, but instead she saw neighbors exchanging glances, nodding slightly. Jacob sat back, saying nothing further. He didn't need to. The neighborhood had seen her at her weakest moment, and now they were voicing doubts openly. For years, Karen had worn her authority like a crown, her clipboard the symbol of her control. But tonight, that crown showed deep cracks. The meeting stumbled along after that, Karen trying desperately to redirect the conversation back to landscaping and events. But the air had shifted. Every word she spoke was met with skeptical eyes and muted whispers. When it finally adjourned, neighbors filed out slowly, talking in low voices. Jacob stood near the door and several people stopped to greet him, offering small words of support. Glad you spoke up, one man said. About time someone did. Karen left quickly, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. For the first time, she didn't linger to chat or assert control. Instead, she hurried to her car, her head low. As Jacob walked home, he couldn't help but reflect on the shift. The Jeep hadn't just exposed Karen's overreach, it had revealed something deeper. The neighborhood no longer saw her as a leader. They saw her as someone who had crossed a line, and now they weren't afraid to say so. The cracks in her crown were spreading, and Jacob suspected it was only a matter of time before it shattered completely. A week after the tense Homeowners Association meeting, the neighborhood was buzzing with quiet anticipation. Word had spread quickly that a formal vote was scheduled, a vote to decide whether Karen would remain as HOA president. Jacob watched the events unfold with a kind of detached curiosity. He hadn't asked for this battle, yet here it was, unfolding right outside his front door. All he had done was stand his ground against unfair treatment. The rest, it seemed, had grown naturally from Karen's own choices. On the evening of the vote, the clubhouse was more crowded than Jacob had ever seen. Residents filled every seat, and some stood along the back wall. The air was thick with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Karen sat at the front table, her familiar clipboard in hand. But her usual confidence was gone. She looked stiff, her lips pressed into a tight line, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Let's call this meeting to order, she said, her voice carrying a forced strength. We have important matters to discuss, including tonight's motion regarding leadership. Mr. Harris rose slowly from his chair. I'll make this simple, he said in his calm, deliberate tone. Karen has served as president for years, and while some of us have appreciated her dedication, recent events have shown a troubling pattern. The incident with Jacob's Jeep was only the latest example. She overstepped her authority, embarrassed this community, and put us all at risk of unnecessary conflict. It's time to ask ourselves if this is the kind of leadership we want. The room erupted with murmurs. Jacob noticed that even those who had once been silent followers were nodding along. Karen stood abruptly, her voice sharp. "This is a witch hunt," she declared. "I've done nothing but uphold the rules. I've sacrificed my time and energy to make this neighborhood better. Without my guidance, standards will fall apart. Is that what you want? Unkempt lawns, noisy vehicles, people doing whatever they please." Mrs. Gomez rose from her chair. "What we want is fairness," she said firmly. "What we want is leadership that listens, not leadership that dictates." Others chimed in, voices overlapping, frustrations spilling out after years of silence. "She fined me for planting the wrong flowers. She threatened to sue me over my fence. She sent letters about my kids' bikes being left outside." It was as if a dam had broken. One by one, the residents gave voice to grievances they had held inside for too long. Karen tried to shout over them, her face flushed red, but the tide had turned. Jacob sat quietly through it all, his presence a reminder of the spark that had set this fire alight. He didn't need to add anything. The neighborhood was speaking for itself now. Finally, the board called for the vote. Slips of paper were passed out, collected in a box, and tallied at the front. The room fell into a hush as the final count was announced. "By majority vote," Mr. Patel read aloud, "Karen is hereby removed as president of the Homeowners Association." A cheer broke out, not loud or mocking, but filled with relief. Some clapped politely, others smiled broadly. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt lighter. Karen, however, sat frozen, her hands gripping the clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You'll regret this," she said in a trembling voice. "You'll see what happens without me." But no one replied. Residents simply filed out of the clubhouse, talking among themselves, already discussing what changes they hoped to see with new leadership. Jacob lingered a moment longer, then stood and walked past Karen. She didn't look up at him, and he didn't stop. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the evening air was cool and refreshing. Neighbors gathered in small groups, chatting animatedly about the future. Some waved at Jacob, others approached to thank him quietly for standing up when others had been too afraid. "All I did was park my Jeep," Jacob said with a small smile. "Sometimes that's all it takes," Mr. Harris replied, patting his shoulder. "One person refusing to back down can change everything." As Jacob walked home, the Jeep gleamed under the streetlights, its polished surface reflecting the calm of the night. It had been more than a vehicle in this battle, it had been a symbol. A reminder that authority unchecked could crumble when confronted by simple truth. And as Karen retreated into the shadows of her once unquestioned rule, the neighborhood moved forward, free of the weight she had imposed for so long. For Jacob, it was just another chapter closed, but for everyone else, it was the start of something new.